The house felt different without David's usual bustling energy. For the first time in months, Emma was home with just her stepson, Alex. She watched as David grabbed his bags, moving with his usual urgency, a cell phone pressed to his ear while he muttered something about last-minute changes. His eyes barely lingered on her as he leaned in for a quick peck on her cheek, his mind clearly already halfway to his destination. "Be good while I'm gone," he called out, glancing at Alex, who was lounging on the couch, half-heartedly scrolling through his phone. Emma tried to smile, ignoring the pang of loneliness that always accompanied his farewells. "Safe travels, David." With a brisk nod, he was out the door, his footsteps fading until the car's engine started up. She listened as he drove away, the hum of the engine growing fainter until there was only silence left in its wake, a silence that somehow felt both calming and uncomfortable. The stillness of the house settled around her, and she let out a slow breath, realizing she hadn't done that in a while, just sat in the quiet, alone with her thoughts. Emma glanced over at Alex, who hadn't seemed to notice his father's departure. He stretched lazily, tossing his phone onto the couch next to him. He looked up at her, a mischievous glint in his eye that made her smile despite herself. "Well," he said, running a hand through his dark hair, "just us for the weekend, huh?" She chuckled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just us." In that moment, Emma was struck by just how much he had changed over the past few years. Alex had grown from a gangly teenager into a confident young man, his features sharpened with age, his shoulders broader than she remembered. There was a maturity in his gaze that hadn't been there before, and it caught her off guard. She quickly looked away, focusing on tidying up the kitchen counter, feeling a strange flutter in her chest she hadn't expected. She busied herself with small tasks, hoping to shake the unsettling feeling of how the house felt without David. A deep sense of calm settled over her, and yet the quiet weekend with just Alex felt like uncharted territory. It was rare to be alone with him. Emma couldn't remember the last time she had spent any extended time with just her stepson since he'd moved back. "Are you hungry?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder at him. "Starving," he replied, flashing her a grin. "Perfect. I'm making pasta. Thought it might be nice to do something simple, just the two of us." He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "Simple sounds good to me. It's been ages since I've had a home-cooked meal." Emma chuckled, feeling a warmth in her chest at the casual compliment. "You don't cook?" "Not much time between school, work, and everything else," he said, shrugging. "Besides, nobody makes food quite like you, Emma." There was something about the way he said her name soft, almost reverent, that made her pause. She blinked, brushing it off as her imagination, chalking it up to her loneliness and David's absence. After all, it had been months since she'd felt seen or appreciated at home. David was always busy, his work hours extending later and later, his attention never quite reaching her anymore. She'd told herself it was just part of the life they'd built together, that it was normal for love to grow routine, even stagnant. But the look in Alex's eyes, warm and appreciative, reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten. She quickly turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce, trying to ignore the way her heart had skipped at his words. The dinner was ready soon, and they sat at the small, cozy dining table, just the two of them. The room was filled with the rich smell of garlic and basil, and for a moment, Emma allowed herself to relax, letting the warmth of the food and company fill the void David had left. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks and the occasional murmur of appreciation. "So," Alex said, breaking the silence, "how have things been?" The question felt loaded, though she wasn't sure why. "Oh, you know, the usual. David's always working. I keep myself busy around the house." "Yeah, I've noticed he's been gone a lot lately." Emma shrugged, attempting to keep her tone light. "He's got a lot on his plate." Alex looked at her for a moment, his gaze intense, as if he could see straight through her. She felt her cheeks warm, embarrassed by how transparent she might seem, how her loneliness could be so easily read. "You don't seem too happy about it," he said softly, his eyes not leaving hers. She forced a laugh, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't be silly. I'm fine." But Alex didn't look convinced. He leaned back, crossing his arms, still watching her, his expression thoughtful. "Well, you don't have to put on an act for me, you know. I'm here if you ever want to talk about anything." The sincerity in his voice touched her, and for a fleeting moment she felt the walls around her heart begin to crumble. But she quickly shook it off, unwilling to admit to herself, or to him, just how lonely she had felt these past few months. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice soft. They finished dinner, and Alex insisted on helping her clear the table. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, falling into an easy rhythm. She handed him plates to put away, his hand brushing against hers once or twice in the process. Each time, a spark of warmth shot up her arm, and she found herself quickly pulling her hand back, berating herself for reacting in such a way. This was her Stepson, for heaven's sake. Yet, as the evening wore on, she couldn't help but feel that this weekend, this time alone with him, might bring a change she hadn't anticipated. Something unspoken lingered in the air between them, something she didn't want to examine too closely. When they finished in the kitchen, they both settled onto the couch, Alex sprawling out comfortably while she sat a little more upright, folding her legs under herself. He glanced over at her, giving her that same warm, mischievous grin that had always charmed everyone around him. She realized with a pang that he was no longer the awkward teenager who had moved in with them. He was a man now, confident and self-assured. They talked late into the night, their conversation covering everything from his college life to her favorite memories of the family vacations they used to take when he was younger. She laughed more than she had in months, the sound surprising even to her. He listened intently, genuinely interested in her stories, and she found herself reveling in the attention. When she finally decided to head to bed, she felt a lingering warmth that was hard to shake. She tried to convince herself it was just the joy of reconnecting with Alex, of feeling close to someone after so much time spent in solitude. But as she lay in bed, her mind drifted back to the way his hand had lingered on hers, the way his eyes seemed to see right through her. In the quiet darkness, Emma couldn't ignore the small flutter of excitement in her chest, a feeling that was both thrilling and terrifying. Building on the emotional undercurrents set in the previous scene. The following morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, bathing the kitchen in a warm golden glow. Emma hummed softly to herself as she prepared breakfast, trying to shake off the unsettling thoughts from the night before. She told herself it was just the thrill of company after feeling so alone, of finally having someone's attention. She loved her husband, she reminded herself, and whatever warmth she felt toward Alex was purely maternal, or so she tried to believe. Morning, Alex's voice came from behind her, and she turned, nearly bumping into him. He was close, closer than she expected, wearing a plain t-shirt that clung to his broad shoulders and athletic frame. She felt her cheeks flush and looked away quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. "Good morning," she replied, focusing on the eggs sizzling in the pan. "I thought I'd make us a big breakfast." "Smells amazing." He leaned against the counter, watching her, and she could feel his gaze on her as she moved around the kitchen. There was a quiet intensity to him, something that made her feel self-conscious, like he was seeing more than just her movements. "What's on the agenda today?" he asked, breaking the silence. She shrugged, flipping the eggs with perhaps a bit too much enthusiasm. "I thought we could just have a relaxed day. Maybe go for a walk? It's beautiful outside." "Sounds good to me." He reached past her to grab a plate from the cupboard, his arm brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a shiver up her spine, and she could feel her pulse quicken. She focused on her cooking, trying to steady her breathing and push away the confusing feelings swirling inside her. As they ate breakfast, they talked about lighter topics: his job search, funny stories from his college days, her garden. She found herself laughing, genuinely enjoying his company, and for a moment it was easy to forget the tension from the previous night. It felt natural, comfortable, like they'd slipped into a rhythm all their own. After breakfast, they headed out for a walk, the fresh morning air crisp and invigorating. The trail they followed wound through a small wooded area behind the house, where they could enjoy the shade of tall trees and the sound of birds chirping. They walked side by side, their steps in sync, and Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. They reached a clearing where a small stream trickled by, its gentle babble adding to the serenity of the moment. Alex knelt down, picking up a smooth stone and skipping it across the water. She watched him, feeling a pang of nostalgia. He had always loved doing that as a kid, and she remembered afternoons spent by the water, cheering him on as he perfected his technique. "You still remember how to skip stones, I see," she teased. He grinned, tossing another stone that skipped twice before sinking. "Some things you never forget." She laughed, picking up a stone of her own and attempting to skip it, though it plopped unceremoniously into the water. He chuckled, stepping beside her and gently placing a hand over hers. "Here, let me show you," he said, guiding her hand as he demonstrated the technique. She tried to focus on his words, but the warmth of his hand over hers, the steady pressure of his fingers guiding hers, made it hard to concentrate. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the strength in his grip, the steadiness of his touch. "Like this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his face close to hers as he watched her attempt. "Exactly." She threw the stone, and it skipped once, twice, before sinking. She laughed, thrilled at the small victory, and he laughed with her, his hand lingering on hers a second too long. When he finally let go, she felt a strange sense of loss, as if something precious had slipped away. They continued walking, falling into a comfortable silence as they took in the beauty around them. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them, something intangible but undeniable. She felt herself drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain, and the rational part of her mind fought to suppress it, to remind herself that he was her stepson, that these feelings were wrong. Back at the house, they spent the afternoon doing small chores together, their movements once again synchronized in a way that felt oddly intimate. They laughed, shared inside jokes, and at one point, he playfully splashed her with water as they washed dishes, making her shriek in mock outrage. She tried to tell herself it was harmless fun, that she was simply enjoying the rare opportunity to bond with him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they settled into the living room to watch a movie. Emma chose a light-hearted comedy, hoping it would help dissipate the tension that had been simmering between them. They sat side by side on the couch, and she tried to keep a respectful distance, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. But halfway through the movie, Alex shifted closer, draping an arm casually across the back of the couch, his fingers just inches away from her shoulder. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the subtle scent of his cologne mingling with the smell of popcorn, and she found herself relaxing, her guard slipping as the movie played on. At one point, she laughed at a scene, and Alex turned to look at her, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "I missed this," he said softly. She glanced at him, her laughter fading as she took in the sincerity in his gaze. "Missed what?" "Being with you. Just spending time together like this. It's been a while." Her heart ached at his words, and she felt a surge of emotion she hadn't anticipated. She realized that she had missed this too, that she had missed having someone who looked at her like she was important, like she mattered. David's absence had left a void she hadn't even realized was there. And in that moment, she felt it fill, just a little, with Alex's presence. "Me too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They sat in silence for a moment, the movie playing on in the background, but neither of them seemed to be watching. She felt his gaze on her, intense and unwavering, and she knew without looking that he was searching her face, trying to read the emotions she was trying so hard to conceal. He reached out, his fingers brushing her hand lightly, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. The touch was innocent, but it ignited a spark that made her pulse race, a warmth spreading through her that she couldn't ignore. "Emma," he began, his voice low, hesitant. She turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, it was as if the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them. She could feel the pull between them, the unspoken connection that had grown stronger with each passing hour, and she knew she should pull away, should put distance between them before it went any further. But she didn't move. She couldn't. A soft thud broke the silence, and they both jumped, startled. Emma laughed nervously, realizing that the remote had fallen off the armrest, breaking the spell between them. She quickly stood, brushing her hands down her jeans, trying to regain her composure. "I should get to bed," she said, forcing a smile. "Long day tomorrow." Alex nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, of course. Sleep well, Emma." She hurried to her room, her heart racing, her mind a whirl of emotions she couldn't quite name. As she closed her bedroom door behind her, she leaned against it, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. In the darkness, she allowed herself to admit the truth she had been avoiding. She was drawn to Alex in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. She didn't know what it meant or what to do about it, but she knew one thing for certain. This weekend was changing everything. "Let me know if you'd like to move on to Act 2, Section 1. You said, "Proceed with the first section of Act 2, minimum of 1,000 words. ChatGPT said, "Here's Act 2, Section 1, as the tension between Emma and Alex continues to grow." Emma awoke early the next morning, hoping to clear her mind with some time alone. She decided to start her day in the garden, her small oasis where she often found solace. The flowers were in full bloom, their colors vibrant in the morning light, and the faint scent of lavender wafted through the air. She focused on trimming and watering, letting the repetitive motions bring her a sense of calm. She needed the calm because last night had left her rattled, her mind buzzing with thoughts she didn't dare admit aloud. That moment with Alex on the couch, the way he'd looked at her, the gentle touch of his hand against hers had shaken her more deeply than she wanted to acknowledge. She kept trying to rationalize it, to convince herself that it was harmless, but the memory of his gaze lingered, leaving her with a warmth she couldn't ignore. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't hear Alex approaching until he was right beside her, his presence jolting her back to the present. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and he smiled down at her, a casual, relaxed smile that only made her feel more on edge. "Morning," he said, hands tucked into his pockets. "Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head, returning his smile as best she could. "No, just wanted to get an early start. The garden always needs attention, especially in the summer." He nodded, watching her as she bent to pull a few stray weeds. She could feel his gaze on her, and the silence stretched between them, charged with something unsaid. She wished he would go back inside, give her space to gather her thoughts, but he made no move to leave. "You have a real talent for this," he said, gesturing to the rows of flowers and neatly trimmed bushes. "It's beautiful out here." "Thank you," she replied, straightening up and brushing dirt from her hands. "It's my little escape." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of his words lingering in the air. She realized that the garden had become an escape from more than just the stresses of daily life. It was a retreat from her marriage, from the loneliness that had settled into her bones over the past few years. She'd poured herself into it, hoping to fill the void that David's absence had left. And now here was Alex, filling that space in a way she hadn't anticipated. Without thinking, she found herself saying, "Would you like to help? I could use an extra pair of hands." He nodded eagerly, stepping closer, and she handed him a pair of gloves, trying to ignore the way her hand brushed against his as she did. They worked side by side, pulling weeds and planting a few new flowers she'd picked up earlier in the week. It was a simple task, but she found herself relaxing in his presence, the tension from the previous night slowly melting away as they talked and laughed. After a while, they both sat back, taking a break and wiping their brows in the warm morning sun. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, noting the way the sunlight played across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the depth of his eyes. She quickly looked away, chastising herself for the direction her thoughts were taking. But Alex, seemingly unaware of her inner turmoil, leaned back on his hands, stretching his legs out in front of him. "I don't remember spending mornings like this when I was a kid," he said, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. She smiled softly, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You were always running around, too full of energy to sit still. I was always chasing after you, trying to keep up." He laughed, a rich, warm sound that sent a shiver through her. "Those were good times," he said, his voice softening. "You know, you've always been more like a friend to me than a stepmom. I've always felt closer to you than I have with my own mom." She looked at him, taken aback by the vulnerability in his voice. His eyes held a warmth that made her heart ache, and she felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to comfort him. But she held herself back, unwilling to cross a line that felt too close already. "I'm glad," she said quietly. "I wanted you to feel at home here, to feel loved." Their gazes met, and in that moment, she knew he felt it too, the pull between them, the unspoken connection that had grown stronger with each passing hour. She could see it in his eyes, in the way his breath caught, the slight parting of his lips, as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Before either of them could speak, the sound of a phone ringing from inside the house broke the spell. Emma jumped, the moment shattered, and she quickly rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her hands. "I should get that," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "It might be David." Alex nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he looked away. She hurried inside, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between them, to gather her thoughts. She couldn't keep letting herself get swept up in these moments, couldn't keep pretending that her feelings for Alex were innocent. She needed to control herself, for both their sakes. The call was from an old friend of David's, checking in to confirm a golf outing they had planned for next month. She answered politely, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying that moment in the garden, the way Alex had looked at her, the unspoken words hanging between them. When she returned outside, Alex had started gathering their gardening tools, putting them away neatly in the small shed at the side of the yard. He didn't look at her as she approached, and she wondered if he was as affected by the morning as she was, if he felt the same strange, exhilarating confusion that had taken hold of her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet moments and stolen glances. They spent the afternoon around the house, tackling small tasks together, their movements synchronized, as if they'd been doing this for years. She found herself seeking out his company, drawn to the easy camaraderie between them, the warmth he brought into the room. As evening fell, they prepared a simple dinner together, sharing small jokes and laughter that felt as natural as breathing. But beneath the light-hearted banter, she could feel the tension simmering, a quiet anticipation that neither of them acknowledged. They danced around it, careful not to say or do anything that would tip them over the edge. After dinner, they settled on the couch once more, a sense of déjà vu washing over her as they chose another movie, trying to keep things light and carefree. But as the movie played on, she felt his arm brush against hers, the warmth of his body so close that it was almost unbearable. At one point, he turned to her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite name. The room felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken words, and she could feel her heart racing, her breath catching as she looked back at him. "Emma," he began, his voice barely a whisper. She swallowed hard, every nerve in her body on edge. She knew she should stop this, should pull away and put some distance between them, but her body betrayed her, leaning ever so slightly toward him, drawn by an invisible force she couldn't resist. In the dim light, their faces were inches apart, and she could feel his breath warm against her skin. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment that felt both forbidden and inevitable. She knew this was dangerous, knew that if she didn't pull away now, she might never be able to. But as his hand reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, she felt herself surrender, giving in to the pull between them, to the quiet intensity of the moment. And then, with a soft sigh, she closed her eyes, letting herself fall into the warmth of his touch, the quiet thrill that had been building for so long finally breaking free. Emma's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears, as Alex's hand lingered, the warmth of his touch grounding her yet pushing her into unknown territory. Every fiber of her being knew this was wrong, that she should pull away, but the way he looked at her, his eyes dark and intent, made it impossible to move. The world felt narrowed down to this single moment, the two of them alone in the soft glow of the living room, surrounded by silence, except for the quiet hum of their breathing. Then, suddenly, a flash of realization cut through the haze. Emma pulled back slightly, her heart pounding, her voice barely a whisper. "Alex, we can't." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. She saw the conflict there, the same struggle she felt, a push and pull of desire and restraint. He nodded slowly, drawing his hand back, but the look in his eyes didn't fade. If anything, the intensity of it only deepened. "I know," he murmured, his voice filled with a softness she hadn't expected. "I know it's complicated, but Emma, I can't ignore how I feel anymore." Her breath caught and she looked away, fighting the confusion and guilt churning inside her. It's just the two of us here. Maybe we're both lonely, both just missing something." "Maybe," he agreed, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "But this doesn't feel like just loneliness to me. It's more than that. I think it has been for a while." Emma closed her eyes, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. She'd known Alex since he was a teenager, watched him grow up, become a man. And now here he was, speaking to her with a tenderness that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. But he was still her stepson, her husband's son. She couldn't let herself get swept away, couldn't allow herself to indulge in feelings that went against everything she believed. "You're David's son," she said softly, as if saying it aloud would make it real, would make it easier to put distance between them. A shadow crossed Alex's face, and he nodded slowly. "I know. I don't want to make things difficult for you, Emma. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable." Her heart twisted at his words, at the sincerity in his gaze. She wanted to tell him that he hadn't made her uncomfortable, that, if anything, she felt a sense of connection, of belonging, that she hadn't felt in a long time, but she bit her tongue, holding back the words, afraid of where they might lead. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their unspoken thoughts hanging heavy in the air. She could feel his gaze on her, and the warmth of it sent a shiver down her spine, making her heart race all over again. She knew she should leave, should go to bed, and put an end to the evening, but something kept her there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. "Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking the stillness. Against her better judgment, she looked at him, meeting his gaze once more. The intensity in his eyes was almost overwhelming, and she felt herself drawn to him, pulled into the depths of his longing. She didn't want to admit it, didn't want to confront the truth of her own feelings, but there was no denying the magnetic pull between them, a connection that seemed impossible to ignore. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The contact was electric, sending a surge of warmth through her that left her breathless. He didn't move, didn't pull away, and she could feel the rapid beat of his pulse under her fingertips, mirroring her own racing heart. "We should stop," she whispered, even as her hand lingered on his, unable to let go. "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible. But he didn't move either, his gaze locked on hers, as if he was waiting for her to make the first move, to decide whether to break the spell or give in to it. In that moment, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of something that could change everything. She knew that if she let herself fall, there would be no going back, that she would be crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But the ache in her heart, the quiet desperation that had been building inside her, made it impossible to turn away. Slowly, almost tentatively, she leaned in, closing the distance between them. Her lips brushed against his in a soft, tentative kiss, and she felt a thrill course through her, a surge of emotion that left her feeling both exhilarated and terrified. Alex responded immediately, his hand coming up to cup her face, pulling her closer as he deepened the kiss. It was gentle, yet filled with a passion that took her breath away, a raw intensity that spoke of feelings he'd kept hidden for far too long. She melted into the warmth of his embrace, losing herself in the softness of his touch, the tenderness of his kiss. For a moment, everything else faded away, the guilt, the fear, the knowledge of what this meant. All that mattered was the way he held her, the way he looked at her, as if she was the only person in the world. But reality came crashing back with brutal clarity, and she pulled away, her breathing ragged, her heart pounding. She looked at him, her face flushed, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. We can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't right. We can't." Alex looked at her, his gaze filled with understanding, but there was a sadness there, a longing that made her heart ache. "I know, Emma. I know it's complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way about you." She swallowed, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. She wanted to tell him that she felt the same, that his words echoed the thoughts she'd been trying so hard to suppress. But she couldn't bring herself to say it, couldn't allow herself to give voice to the feelings that were tearing her apart. Instead, she stood up, putting distance between them, her hands shaking as she ran a hand through her hair. I think we need to take a step back," she said, trying to steady her voice. "This weekend, it's been wonderful, Alex, but it's clouding our judgment." He looked away, nodding slowly, his expression pained. "You're probably right." They stood in silence, the tension between them heavy and unbreakable. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the unspoken words that lingered in the air. But she couldn't bring herself to look at him. She was afraid that if she did, she would lose whatever strength she had left, that she would fall back into his arms and let herself be swept away by the emotions she'd been trying so hard to deny. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll go for a walk. Clear my head." She nodded, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between them. "That's probably a good idea." He moved past her, his steps slow and deliberate, and she felt her heart twist as he walked away, the ache of his absence filling her with a sense of loss she couldn't explain. She watched him go, her chest tight, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. As he disappeared down the path, she sank onto the couch, her hands trembling as she buried her face in them. She couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep fighting a battle she knew she was losing. She felt torn between her loyalty to her husband, to the life she'd built, and the undeniable connection she felt with Alex, a connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. In the quiet of the empty house, she allowed herself to confront the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for him. It was wrong, it was forbidden, but it was real. And she didn't know how much longer she could keep resisting. The house felt emptier than ever without him, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. She knew she should use the time alone to gather her thoughts, to remind herself of the boundaries she needed to keep. But as she sat there, her heart heavy with unspoken feelings, she realized that the line between right and wrong had already blurred. When Alex returned from his walk, they would have to face the reality of what had happened. They would have to decide where to go from here, to confront the choices that lay ahead. And for the first time, Emma wasn't sure she was strong enough to make the right one. The air in the house felt thick and charged as the evening wore on. Emma sat at the dining table, her thoughts swirling, unable to focus on anything for more than a few seconds. She'd barely spoken to Alex since he'd returned from his walk. He'd slipped back into the house quietly, as if sensing that they both needed space, yet the distance between them had only made her long for him more. Emma glanced at the clock well past dinner. Normally, she would have been in the kitchen, preparing something warm and comforting, the clinking of plates and the soft hum of the stove filling the silence. But tonight, she couldn't bring herself to go through the motions. It felt as though they were both waiting, caught in a moment suspended between what they wanted and what they knew they couldn't have. Just as she began to wonder if he'd decided to avoid her altogether, Alex appeared in the doorway. He paused, his gaze flicking over her face, taking in her tense posture, the way her hands twisted nervously in her lap. She felt a wave of vulnerability, an ache that she couldn't quite place. She realized that she wanted him to break the silence, to make everything feel normal again, or to admit what they were both feeling. But he didn't. Instead, he approached her slowly, his steps soft, hesitant. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but far enough that the space between them felt like a chasm. His eyes met hers, filled with an intensity that took her breath away. "Emma," he began, his voice low, barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and gestured to the empty chair across from her. He sat down, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he ran a hand through his hair. She waited, her heart pounding, her palms sweaty as she tried to prepare herself for whatever he was about to say. But when he spoke, his words surprised her. "I never wanted to put you in this position," he said softly, his gaze steady and sincere. "I never wanted to complicate things between us, but I can't ignore how I feel." The vulnerability in his voice undid her, and she felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself, but the weight of his words left her feeling exposed, raw. "Alex," she hesitated, searching for the right words, but they seemed to slip through her fingers, elusive and impossible to grasp. "This is all so confusing. You're David's son, your family. This shouldn't even be happening." He looked away, his jaw clenched, and she could see the struggle in his expression. She knew he felt the same conflict, the same push and pull of emotions that left her feeling unsteady, lost. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice barely audible, "but I can't help it, Emma. I feel closer to you than I've felt to anyone in a long time." The honesty in his words pierced through her defenses, breaking down the last of her resolve. She looked down, her hands trembling as she tried to process what he was saying, what it all meant. "I don't know what to do, Alex," she admitted, her voice shaky, her heart aching. "I don't know how to handle this. I've been trying to ignore it, trying to pretend it's just loneliness or something. But every time I look at you, every time you're near me, it feels like I'm losing control." The admission hung in the air, a truth they had both been avoiding but could no longer deny. She felt a mixture of relief and fear, knowing that she'd finally said it aloud, that there was no turning back. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his touch warm and grounding. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection, a sense that he understood her in a way no one else ever had. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered, his voice filled with sincerity. "I don't want to mess up your life or make things harder for you, but I can't pretend this isn't real. I can't just ignore it." She felt her throat tighten, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She'd spent so long feeling invisible, feeling as though her needs, her desires were secondary to everything else. But here was Alex, looking at her with a depth of understanding that left her feeling seen, cherished, in a way she hadn't felt in years. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He squeezed her hand gently, his gaze unwavering. "I don't know. Maybe there isn't a right answer. Maybe we just take it one step at a time." The simplicity of his words struck her, and she felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark of possibility in the midst of her confusion. She didn't know where this would lead, didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, all she wanted was to hold on to this connection, to let herself feel without the weight of guilt or fear. They sat in silence, their hands intertwined, a quiet understanding passing between them. She knew they couldn't stay in this moment forever, that reality would come crashing back sooner or later. But for now, she allowed herself to lean into the warmth of his touch, to let herself believe, if only for a fleeting moment, that maybe this wasn't as impossible as it seemed. After a long silence, she pulled her hand back, her fingers tingling from the absence of his touch. She forced herself to look away, to break the intensity of his gaze, and took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We'll take it slow," she said, her voice barely steady. "We'll figure it out together." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips, and she felt a flicker of hope, a sense of peace she hadn't expected. They had a long road ahead of them, a path filled with uncertainty and risk, but for the first time in a long time, she felt as though she wasn't alone. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding, a shared determination to navigate whatever came their way. She knew it wouldn't be easy, knew that there would be moments of doubt and fear, but as she looked at him, saw the steady resolve in his eyes, she felt a spark of courage, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. They shared a final look, a silent promise hanging between them, and in that moment, she knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but as long as he was by her side, she felt ready to take the first step. The following morning, Emma awoke with a sense of both dread and anticipation. The sun filtered softly through her curtains, casting gentle shadows across the room. Her mind was still clouded with memories of the night before, the intensity of Alex's gaze, the feel of his hand over hers, the quiet understanding that had passed between them. It had been exhilarating, comforting, but also terrifying. She forced herself to sit up, brushing a hand through her hair as she tried to shake off the remnants of sleep. She knew she needed to be careful, to keep a clear head. This was a line she could not afford to cross any further. But even as she reminded herself of the risks, a part of her felt drawn to Alex in a way that defied all reason. The sound of movement in the kitchen pulled her from her thoughts. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before making her way down the hall. She found Alex at the stove, flipping pancakes with a relaxed ease, a lightness in his posture that felt new, unguarded. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft, as if they shared a secret. "Good morning." She returned his smile, feeling her heart flutter at the warmth in his gaze. She took a seat at the table, her mind racing as she tried to find the right words. Everything felt so fragile, like they were walking on a thin line that could snap at any moment. He set a plate of pancakes in front of her, taking the seat across from her, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few moments. The air between them felt different, charged, but also filled with an unspoken understanding. She wanted to talk about what had happened, to give voice to the feelings swirling inside her, but the words seemed too dangerous, too final. After a while, Alex broke the silence, his tone gentle. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Emma. If this is too much, I'll respect that." She looked up, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his gaze. She knew he meant it, that he was giving her an out, a way to walk away before they crossed the line they couldn't uncross. But the thought of ending this, of going back to the distance that had once felt safe, left her with an ache she couldn't ignore. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm torn between everything I know is right and everything I feel." He nodded, his expression thoughtful, and she felt a surge of gratitude for his understanding, his willingness to let her set the pace. "We don't have to make any decisions right now," he said gently. "We can just see where this goes." The simplicity of his words struck her, and she felt a flicker of hope, a sense of possibility she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Maybe they didn't have to define this, didn't have to put a label on something so complex, so fragile. Maybe they could just take it one day at a time, without the weight of expectations or guilt. They finished breakfast in a comfortable silence, the tension between them easing as they fell into an easy rhythm. She felt herself relax, allowing the moment to wash over her, letting herself believe, if only for a few minutes, that this could be something beautiful, something worth exploring. As the day went on, they spent time around the house, tackling small chores together and sharing quiet conversations that felt more meaningful than anything she'd experienced in years. She felt a connection with him that went beyond attraction, a depth of understanding that left her feeling seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. In the afternoon, they decided to take a walk, the cool breeze refreshing as they strolled along a quiet trail near the edge of town. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and memories, letting themselves forget the weight of their situation. She felt a lightness in her chest, a sense of freedom she hadn't known was possible, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't bound by the limitations of her marriage, a life where she could be with someone who truly understood her. But as they made their way back to the house, a familiar figure stood by the front door, waiting. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she recognized David's car parked in the driveway, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. Panic surged through her, her mind racing as she tried to process his unexpected arrival. "David?" She forced a smile, trying to steady her voice as they approached. "I thought you weren't coming back until tomorrow." He smiled, pulling her into a quick embrace. "Finished up early," he explained, his gaze flicking briefly to Alex before returning to her. "Thought I'd surprise you." She felt Alex tense beside her, and she shot him a warning glance, silently begging him to keep his composure. The easy rhythm they'd shared all day shattered instantly, replaced by a tension that left her feeling exposed, vulnerable. "Good to see you, Alex," David said, his tone cordial but distant. "Hope you two have been keeping busy." Emma forced a laugh, her mind racing as she tried to come up with anything to say. "Yes, we've been, just taking care of things around the house," she said, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. She felt Alex's gaze on her, sensed the unspoken tension between them, but she couldn't risk meeting his eyes. David looked at them both, a curious expression crossing his face, and she felt a flash of fear, wondering if he could sense the shift between her and Alex, the unspoken connection they'd been trying so hard to hide. "Let's get inside," she said quickly, taking his hand and leading him into the house. Alex followed, his movements slow and measured, and she could feel the weight of his gaze on her back as they stepped into the living room. They spent the evening together, but the easy camaraderie she'd shared with Alex was gone, replaced by a suffocating tension that left her feeling trapped, as though every word, every glance was a betrayal. David chatted about his trip, sharing stories and updates, but her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts consumed by the memory of Alex's touch, the quiet understanding they'd shared that morning. As the evening wore on, she excused herself, retreating to her room under the pretense of needing to rest. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to steady her breathing, her mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door, and she froze, her heart racing as she opened it to find Alex standing there, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to say goodnight," he said quietly, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that left her breathless. "Good night," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, lingering for a moment before turning to go, and she felt a pang of longing as she watched him walk away, the weight of their unspoken connection settling heavily in her chest. She knew this was dangerous, knew that the risks were mounting with each passing moment, but she couldn't bring herself to let go. As she lay in bed that night, she felt the ache of his absence, the emptiness that David's return had only made more apparent. She knew she was playing with fire, that this path could only lead to heartbreak, but a part of her couldn't help but wonder if some fires were worth the burn. She closed her eyes, her mind drifting back to the quiet moments they'd shared. The feeling of his hand over hers, the warmth of his gaze. She knew it wasn't fair, that she was crossing a line that would change everything. But the thought of a life without him, without the connection they'd found, left her feeling hollow. In the darkness, she made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to navigate this, to make sense of the conflicting emotions that had taken hold of her heart. She would find a path forward, even if it meant risking everything. The following days passed in a blur of tension and stolen glances. David's unexpected return had disrupted the quiet rhythm Emma and Alex had fallen into, leaving both of them on edge, struggling to keep up appearances. Every shared meal, every polite exchange between the three of them felt heavy with unspoken words, a palpable tension simmering just below the surface. Emma found herself constantly torn between guilt and longing, caught in a web of emotions that seemed impossible to untangle. One evening, after David had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion from his trip, Emma found herself lingering in the kitchen, her hands working mindlessly as she cleaned up from dinner. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator, and she let herself relax for a moment, allowing her thoughts to drift to Alex. The memory of their shared moments lingered, a constant reminder of the connection she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. The soft creak of footsteps broke her reverie, and she turned to find Alex standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He hesitated, as if unsure of whether he should interrupt, but after a moment he stepped forward, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that left her breathless. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. "I wanted to talk to you. I feel like we haven't really had a chance to talk since he got back." The unspoken meaning of his words hung heavy in the air, and she felt her heart begin to race, a mixture of fear and anticipation flooding her senses. She glanced toward the hallway, half expecting David to appear, but the house remained silent, as if holding its breath alongside her. "Alex, this is dangerous," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If he sees us like this." "I know," he said, his tone steady, though there was an edge of desperation in his gaze. "But I can't keep pretending, Emma. I can't keep acting like nothing's changed." She felt the weight of his words settle over her, and she realized with a pang of guilt that he was right. She had been pretending, trying to ignore the shift between them, hoping that if she avoided the truth long enough, it would somehow disappear. But she couldn't deny it any longer. Their connection had changed, deepened, in a way that went beyond the boundaries of family, of anything she'd ever experienced. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm torn, Alex. I want to do what's right, but I can't ignore how I feel." The vulnerability in her words seemed to embolden him, and he took a step closer, his gaze intense, filled with an emotion that left her feeling exposed, raw. "You're not alone, Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I feel it too. I've felt it since the first night we were alone together." Her breath caught at his confession, and she felt a surge of emotion she couldn't suppress, a mixture of relief and fear, of longing and guilt. She knew this was wrong, knew that they were treading on dangerous ground, but in that moment, all she could think about was the warmth of his touch, the quiet understanding they shared. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and she felt a jolt of electricity at the contact, a warmth that spread through her, filling the emptiness that had settled in her heart over the years. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, the rest of the world faded away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment that felt both forbidden and inevitable. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, even as she leaned into his touch, her resolve crumbling with each passing second. "It's too risky. He'll find out, and I don't know what will happen." Alex's expression softened, a mixture of sadness and determination in his gaze. "I know it's complicated, Emma, but I can't let you go. Not now, not after everything." The sincerity in his words broke something inside her, and she felt the last of her defenses fall away, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. She knew this was dangerous, knew that there would be consequences. But in that moment, the weight of her longing outweighed the fear. She leaned into him, allowing herself to be swept up in the warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart against hers, a grounding presence in the chaos of her emotions. They stood there in silence, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging that filled the emptiness in her heart. She knew this wasn't a solution, knew that the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but for now, she let herself believe in the possibility of a future that didn't feel bound by guilt or fear. But the sound of footsteps down the hall shattered the moment, and they pulled apart quickly, both of them frozen in place as David appeared in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over them, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual, but she could hear the edge in his voice, the unspoken question that lingered beneath his words. Emma forced a smile, her mind racing, as she tried to come up with an explanation, something that would ease his suspicion without raising further questions. "Yes, just finishing up in here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Alex was just helping me clean up." David's gaze lingered on her, for a moment longer. His eyes narrowed, and she felt her heart pound in her chest, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a heavy stone. She held her breath, waiting for him to say something, to question the closeness he'd walked in on. But after a long moment, he simply nodded, turning away without another word. The silence that followed his departure was thick with tension, and she felt the weight of her actions settle over her, the reality of what she was risking hitting her with brutal clarity. She looked at Alex, her heart aching, and she knew that they couldn't keep going down this path, that the danger was too great, the risks too high. "We can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice filled with regret. "It's too dangerous, Alex. We were almost caught, and I can't put you in that position. I can't put us through this." The pain in his gaze was unmistakable, but he nodded slowly, his expression resigned. "I understand," he said softly, his voice filled with sadness. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Emma. If this is what you need." Her chest tightened at his words. The thought of losing him, of going back to the emptiness she'd felt before, almost unbearable. But she knew he was right, knew that this was the only way to protect them both, to keep their lives from unraveling. She reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek in a final, fleeting touch, and she felt a surge of longing, a quiet desperation that left her feeling hollow, empty. She wanted to hold on to him, to keep him close, but she knew it wasn't possible, that their connection, however real it felt, was a risk she couldn't afford. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "for everything. You've made me feel alive again." He offered her a small, bittersweet smile, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You deserve to feel that way, Emma. And I hope you find happiness." They stood in silence, the weight of their goodbye settling heavily between them, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek, the finality of the moment hitting her with brutal clarity. She knew this was the right choice, knew that they were doing what needed to be done, but the pain of it, the emptiness it left behind, was almost too much to bear. As he turned to leave, she watched him go, her heart breaking with each step he took, the distance between them growing with every passing second. She felt a sense of loss, a hollow ache that left her feeling unmoored, adrift in a sea of emotions she couldn't control. In the quiet of the empty kitchen, she allowed herself to grieve, to mourn the connection they'd shared, the fleeting happiness she'd found in his presence. She knew it was over, knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges, but for now, she let herself remember the moments of warmth, the quiet understanding they'd shared. As she stood there, alone in the darkness, she made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to move forward, to rebuild the life she'd almost lost, even if it meant letting go of the one person who had made her feel alive again. Days turned into weeks, and Emma did her best to return to the rhythm of her life. The quiet moments in the kitchen, the familiar hum of the house, the routines with David that once felt comforting now felt hollow, each day a reminder of the emptiness left behind in Alex's absence. Since their parting, he'd kept his distance, throwing himself into work and friends, leaving Emma to sort through her own life without him. Yet, every now and then, she'd catch a glimpse of him coming back from a run, or passing through the living room on his way out. He'd offer her a polite nod, a fleeting smile, but there was a distance in his gaze, a wall between them, that left her feeling as though they were strangers once again. David, oblivious to the emotional whirlwind that had upended her life, continued on as if nothing had changed. He filled their evenings with stories of work and future plans, sharing dreams and goals he assumed they still held together. She would nod, forcing herself to respond, to go through the motions, but a part of her felt as though she was floating, disconnected from the life she had once embraced so fully. One evening, while David was out at a work function, Emma found herself alone in the house, the silence pressing down on her. She wandered through the rooms aimlessly, memories of her time with Alex filling her mind. She could still feel his presence, the warmth of his touch, the depth of his gaze, a quiet reminder of the connection they had shared, a connection that had changed her in ways she couldn't ignore. She ended up in the living room, standing by the couch where they'd shared those stolen moments, her fingers tracing the fabric as if she could somehow capture the warmth that had once lingered there. She closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her, feeling the ache of his absence, the emptiness that had settled in her heart. "Emma?" Her eyes flew open, and she turned to see Alex standing in the doorway, his expression filled with the same sadness and longing that had haunted her for weeks. She felt her heart skip, a mixture of joy and fear flooding her senses as she took in the sight of him, the quiet intensity in his gaze. "I didn't think you'd be here," he murmured, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I thought you'd be with David tonight." "He had a work thing," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm here alone." They stood in silence, the weight of their unspoken emotions hanging heavy in the air, and she felt a familiar warmth spread through her, a mixture of relief and longing that left her feeling vulnerable, exposed. "I miss you," he said softly, his gaze holding hers, and she felt her heart ache at the sincerity in his words. She looked away, fighting the urge to reach out to bridge the distance between them. But the pain of their separation, the emptiness it had left, was almost too much to bear. She felt her resolve crumbling, the walls she had built beginning to fall away, leaving her raw, open. "I miss you too," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But we can't go back to how things were. It's too risky. It would destroy everything." "I know," he replied, his expression pained. "But I don't know how to move on, Emma. I don't know how to go back to my life, knowing what we shared." She felt a tear slip down her cheek, her heart breaking as she listened to the raw honesty in his words, the quiet desperation that mirrored her own. She wanted to tell him that she felt the same, that the ache of his absence was a constant, gnawing pain, but she knew that giving in would only make things harder, would only deepen the wounds they were trying so hard to heal. "I wish things were different," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish we could be together, without all the complications, without the guilt." He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them, his gaze filled with a depth of feeling that took her breath away. Maybe we were meant to find each other," he said softly. "Maybe in another life, things would have been different." The thought hung between them, a bittersweet promise of a love that could never be, a connection that had no place in the life they'd built. She felt her heart twist, the pain of their separation mingling with the quiet hope of what might have been, a life where they could have been together, free from the constraints that bound them. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a final, fleeting touch, and she felt a surge of warmth, a quiet comfort that filled the emptiness inside her. They stood there in silence, their hands intertwined, and she let herself savor the moment, the quiet understanding that lingered between them. "I'll never forget you," he murmured, his voice barely audible, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek, her heart breaking at the finality of his words. "I'll never forget you either," she whispered, her voice filled with the weight of her unspoken love, the quiet promise of a connection that would remain, even in his absence. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her cheek in a gentle, tender kiss, a farewell that spoke of all the words they couldn't say, all the feelings they couldn't express. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel, to let go, and in that moment, she felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that left her feeling whole, even as he pulled away. They shared a final, lingering look, and she felt the weight of their parting settle over her, a quiet ache that would remain long after he was gone. She watched him turn, his steps slow and measured as he left the room, disappearing into the quiet darkness, leaving her alone in the empty house. As the door closed behind him, Emma felt a sense of finality, a quiet resolution that left her feeling both free and broken. She knew that their connection would remain, a quiet memory that would linger in the shadows of her heart, a reminder of a love that could never be, a love that had changed her in ways she couldn't deny. In the quiet of the empty house, she allowed herself to grieve, to mourn the loss of the life she had dreamed of, the life they might have shared. She knew that moving forward would be difficult, that the ache of his absence would be a constant companion, but she also knew that she couldn't live in the past, couldn't cling to a love that was impossible. As she stood in the silence, she made a promise to herself, a promise to find happiness, to create a life that was her own, even if it meant letting go of the one person who had made her feel truly alive. In the end, she knew that their love would remain, a quiet, unspoken bond that would stay with her, a part of her heart that would never truly heal. But she also knew that life would go on, that the path ahead was filled with possibility, even if it was marked by the memory of a love that would forever remain out of reach. With a quiet resolve, she turned away from the doorway, stepping into the quiet of the empty house, ready to face the future, whatever it might hold.